Welcome back. Last week, during my introduction to this course, I forgot to say a word about the opening image on our opening slide. You might have wondered, what is that ship doing there? Well, that ship is the SS Conteverde of the Italian shipping line Lloyd Triestino, and it's moored here pierside in Shanghai. Well, obviously, this class being a class on travel literature, we will talk a lot about ships and other modes of transportation. But the ship, I think, especially the steamship, is of particular importance to this class. So let me say a few more words. Now, as I said last week, MLL 400 spends the entire 20th century and a little bit of the 19th, and a little bit of the 21st, right? And that is because I think the 20th century really was a century of travel, right? We've said that we wanted to talk about these works of literature that we are encountering in this class in the context of longing and exoticism, colonialism and trade, political reasons and educational reasons, exile and displacement, and lastly, tourism. And incidentally, the SS Conteverde, here you have her showing her stern, right, the back of the ship, played a role in all of these. And I will refer back to the Conteverde or other steamships as we make our way through the class, because I really like ships, you see. Now, what is very important to remember is that the 20th century could not have become the century of travel, so to speak, had it not been for the political upheavals, the technical advances, and the societal changes of the 19th century. Which is why we also have to talk a little bit about the 19th century, and we will do, of course, especially this week and next week. The 19th century, really, as distinguished from the 20th century, was arguably the century of steam, right? Steam engines, which had been really developed a century earlier already, really came into being on factory floors, railways, and steamships in the middle of the 19th century. The 19th century was also the century of modern nation states. A bunch of what we now call modern nation states really came into being. Some of them, like the US, might have been founded earlier, but really found their footing in the 19th century as global players. Germany, as another example, really only came into being in 1871. Meiji Japan, we'll be talking about that today. And even arguably Qing Dynasty China started to think of itself as a nation state among nations. So this idea of modernization, both in terms of institutions, but also, on an industrial level, on a commerce level, trade level, very important. And finally, the 19th century really is a century of colonial expansion and imperialism. And here, of course, the main players were Great Britain and France, Germany to a lesser extent, the US arguably also played a role, and very important, Japan. And we'll be talking more about that next week and the week after. So trade and administration, conflict and war, and tourism all relates, of course, to the project of colonialism, and all that really started in the 19th century and was to continue throughout the 20th century. So I said trains and steam engines, very important in the 19th century. Here you have a poem from probably the middle of the 19th century, a eulogy really to this wonder of technology, the steam train. As we rush in the train, the trees and the houses go wheeling back, but the starry heavens above the plain come flying on our track. All the beautiful stars of the sky, the silver doves of the forest of night, over the dull earth swarm and fly, companions of our flight. We will rush ever on without fear. Let the goal be far, the flight be fleet, for we carry the heavens with us, dear, while the earth slips from our feet. You see, the speed that the train, the steam engine, made possible, and the traveling over long distances, all that hadn't been possible really until the invention of the steam engine. So we see this really in the 18th century, in the 19th century, but then of course the 20th century carries that a step further and makes travel, especially travel over long distances, international travel, possible. Really the symbol of this, especially in Europe, also in the United States, of course, are the palaces of glass and steel built for the modern traveler, and that of course is the railway station, right? Often the central stations in the middle of towns, Paris, London, Berlin, right? If you've traveled in Europe, you've seen those huge, really, palaces of steel and glass. Very impressive, right? So all that really, symbol of travel in the 19th and early 20th century. Now, steam engines, steamships. Here's another poem, which I think, again, shows us the fascination people had with this new mode of transportation. With steaming pennants, scorning sail, and oar, with steady tramp and swift revolving wheel, and even pulse from throbbing heart of steel, she plies her arrowy course from shore to shore. In vain the siren calms her steps allure, in vain the billows thunder on her keel. Her giant form may toss and rock and reel, and shiver in the wintry tempest roar. The calms and storms alike her pride can spurn. True to the day she keeps her appointed time. Long leagues of ocean vanish at her stern. She drinks the air and tastes another clime, where men their former wonder fast unlearn, which hailed her coming as a thing sublime, right? This idea that the steam engine, these huge machines, are really a thing sublime of a new age, right? Here you have an image from 1840, the Britannia, the first steamer of the Cunard line. That, of course, was a very important shipping company, mostly for the transatlantic trade, right? And transportation of passengers. Steamships then played a tremendous role in this century of travel of the 20th century and of the 19th century. And I told you already, I'm into ships. I like ships. I like shipping companies. I listed here some of the big famous shipping companies, and we'll come across them in some of our readings. P&O, Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, one of the first, 1840, which started out as providing mail services and cruises to the Mediterranean. Here you have a P&O steamer in Venice around 1870. But in the mid-19th century, P&O also entered the opium trade. A little bit more about that later today. Also the British India Steam Navigation Company, probably for similar reasons, right? Mail services to the Far East and the opium trade. Also providing passenger services, right? I mentioned that the colonial enterprise had a huge impact on travel. Well, of course, you had to bring colonial administrators, troops, and of course also just travelers to these far away places of the ever-growing British Empire, India, Australia, countries or territories in Africa. Now the Germans had their own steam companies, Hapag-Lloyd and the North German Lloyd, out of Hamburg and Bremen. You had the Lloyd Triestino of Italy, we already mentioned that, Messagerie Maritime of France, and you had Nippon Yusen of Japan. So this idea then of overcoming great distances at great speed and in tremendous comfort, right? That was really the thing of these steamships that grew continually in size. I say in speed because they really were very speedy. It took about 4 weeks from London to Shanghai on a steamer like that. In the age of sail, it would have taken 3 to 4 months, and then going back and forth, you depended on the winds, could have been a journey of a year or more easily. So with steamships, that's cut into a month. You had schedules that you could stick to, greatly facilitated travel. Yeah. So mail cargo commerce, colonial administration, and yes, tourism. More and more people traveled because it just became more and more affordable. A trip to, East Asia in the age of sail would have been incredibly expensive because you would have had to pay for your lodging on a ship for several months. All of this is cut, prices dramatically cut, and of course capacity of these ships increases. That tourism really becomes possible precisely because of these ever bigger steamships, because transportation costs greatly decrease, right? Travel for pleasure becomes an option, becomes a possibility for more and more people, right? So we see then in the 19th and especially in the 20th century, traveling for pleasure becomes more and more of a common thing. Now, if we were to focus also on the 19th century, we would of course have to read one of the probably most famous travel novels some of you might have heard of by a French author called Jules Verne, and the name of the work, of course, is Around the World in 80 Days, Le Tour du Monde en 80 jours, written in 1872. If you don't know it, you should Google it, and maybe you should even read it. It's a wonderful novel that takes protagonist Phileas Fogg and his butler around the world in 80 days. It's a wager, it's a bet. He wants to prove that it's possible to do this. And he sets out in London, he travels through the Suez Canal to India, and then from India by rail, crosses the Indian subcontinent. Then he goes by ship to Hong Kong, goes on to Japan, then from Japan across the Pacific to San Francisco, and then by rail he crosses the American continent, and then by ship back to London. So this novel then, in a very interesting way, is a reflection of this engagement with modernity, right? Traveling through these new nation states, traveling by means of these technological advances of the 19th century. And as such, it really, it's not really science fiction. Jules Verne also wrote a lot of science fiction. It's theoretically almost possible in 1872 to do that. Now, the novel, interestingly, also coincides with some real events. It coincides with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in America, 1869, right, which made it possible to travel from one coast of the U.S. to the other in just a few days. The linking of the Indian railways across India, right, the Indian subcontinent, 1870, and finally the opening of the Suez Canal right here in 1869, which hugely cut travel time and travel costs from Europe to Asia, because you didn't have to go around all of Africa anymore. The opening of the Suez Canal is maybe particularly interesting because, yes, it had a huge impact on travel, but of course it also, again, reflects the project of colonialism and European imperialism. So the canal was built and operated by the Suez Canal Company, that was majority owned by French private investors and later actually the UK government, even though it went right through Egypt, right? And it was on Egyptian territory. It was eventually nationalized in 1956, giving rise to the Suez Crisis. I don't know if we'll have time and an opportunity to talk about that later. But again, right, it shows us that intricate connection between all of these things, the technological possibilities that the 19th century gave people, right, to build a canal like that. And again, without the availability of steam pumps and steam diggers, this would not have been possible. At the same time, of course, colonialism, mercantilism gave the reasons for this. Capitalism, modern capitalism, gave the capital to make this possible. So all of this then really is interconnected. But of course today we really want to start reading some concrete travel literature, right? And if you've looked at the syllabus, you've seen that our first author is a Chinese author called Huang Zunxian. Here you have him. And we will read some poetry. Okay, we will read some poetry that Huang Zunxian read while he was in Japan. Now, as you read the poetry and as you read that little introductory text that I put on iLearn, I want you to bear a few general questions in mind and, of course, a few specific questions. So should you choose to write a reading response this week, these are some of the things that you might want to reflect about. So the questions that should guide us really throughout this entire class are these. To what degree is the work a product of the language and culture that produced it, right? In this case of 19th century China. What kind of image does it project of the culture or country the writer is traveling to? What larger socio-historic phenomenon is the work responding to or a product of? And with regard to Huang Zunxian and his poetry, I want to ask you, why did a Chinese official travel to Tokyo in 1877? Why did he write poetry about what he saw there? What kind of picture does he paint of Tokyo? What does his account tell us about Huang Zunxian, about Qing Dynasty China, about Meiji Japan? And how do we as 21st century travelers react to Huang's account? I will see you shortly for the second course stream.